60 years into the Pax Norwegicus, the Norwegian peace, one may wonder, how did this all come about? Because as we know, Norway started out as a fairly small regional power. So how could all of this be achieved? Well, that was through the might of the Norwegian Navy. And we're going to take a look at that and the ships, some of the ships, notably in service with that navy in its 75-year golden age from 1890 to 1965. The Valhalla class armored cruiser was one of the first ships in the 1890s Norwegian Navy. At that time, shipyards were not capable of producing actual capital ships like battleships, but it was thought that a tough, well-armored cruiser could do pretty much the same job, at least in coastal waters. With a top speed of only 60 knots, the Valhalla class armored cruiser was considered slow, even by the standards of the 1890s. However, it had a main belt of 8 inches, tapered to 6 at the fore and aft section, and an impressive main battery of 10 9-inch guns, one mounted centerline, and 2 double turrets on each flank, giving it a broadside of 6 9-inch guns, and a single secondary turret of 6 inches. That was pretty good. That let it outgun any enemy armored cruiser that it could face, at least when it came to combined firepower. There were some Austrian armored cruisers that had heavier guns, although those would still be put to use in the Norwegian Navy a couple years later, after they were received as war operations. The Ulf class light cruiser was very similar to the Valhalla in that it was very slow, even by the standards of the day, and it had fairly thick armor for a light cruiser. However, it really didn't see a lot of success, and they were quickly phased out and supplemented by light cruisers taken as war operations from Spain and Germany. One such captured light cruiser was the German Medusa class. Several of these were taken as war operations, but only the Moss was spared and kept as a museum ship in the museum port of Oulu in Finland. It was quite a bit faster than the Ulf class, and although it was quickly rendered obsolete not that many years after it was received by the Norwegian Navy, it was a much needed boost, because the number of light cruisers in service were dwindling after some of the Ulf class were sunk, and the need for light cruisers was ever increasing. But if there was one captured ship class that really was beneficial to the Norwegian Navy, it was the many French-built Fabergé T-36 class torpedo boats taken over after a war in the 1890s. At this time, the Norwegian Navy was in badly need of more torpedo boats. It only had 8 to begin with, and those had almost all been lost. So many dozens of these were received from the French and rendered very effective service for many years to come, with a couple of upgrades and improvement to the torpedo placement and torpedo propulsion and even torpedo size during their service. For only 200 tons, these proved to be very small and hard to hit by enemy gunfire. And with improved engines, like the gear turbines Originally, these had multiple expansion steam engines. The speed could be increased to a maximum of 31 knots, which at the time was very speedy. Norwegian shipbuilding would soon find its stride with the Harald Hårfagre class battleships, launched in 1894. At the time of their construction, they were the largest and most advanced battleships afloat, and would remain relevant in frontline service even into the early Dreadnought era. The two ships, Harald Hårfagre and Odin, would soon earn their spurs in the war in 1895 with Germany, where they would each engage and sink German battleships, taking very little, if no damage, in return. Originally, their main armament consisted of two double 12-inch turrets, and they had a secondary battery of 7-inch guns. However, they were refit a number of times before retirement. Harald Hårfagre would unfortunately sink in her last battle just before she was slated for retirement. Odin did live on to retire and became a museum ship. Her final configuration consists of two triple 11-inch turrets and a secondary battery of 6.1-inch guns. While they had both sunk a number of enemy pre-dreadnought battleships during their time in service, the Harald Hårfagre's greatest hour came perhaps in a war with France in the early 1910s, when she, assisting a couple of Hel-class battlecruisers, engaged a flotilla of French dreadnought battleships. The two battlecruisers, which were new and quite advanced at the time, did have a weakness in that they did not have a lot of ammunition stored on board in their magazines, so they did run out of ammunition during the course of the battle, leaving the last two French dreadnought battleships to be engaged by Harald Hårfagre. In what could be seen as an almost suicidal charge, Harald Hårfagre closed the distance with the two French dreadnought battleships and sank them with close-range AP salvos from her 12-inch main battery. While she did take a lot of damage in return and was barely afloat, the battle was a victory, and the two battlecruisers, which were, despite out of ammo, in good condition, was able to tow the damaged Harald Hårfagre back to port, where she could be repaired. Another battleship design of the same era, but far less illustrious, was the Thor-class battleship. Designed before the Harald Hårfagre, it was already a quite obsolete ship by the time it was launched, and her main battery consisted of just one single double-barrel turret. This ship has not been preserved and did not really render any notable service. She did engage in one naval battle with the Russians in the Baltic War of 1902, where she engaged a Russian light cruiser. However, her poor gunnery allowed the Russian to close in and launch her and hit her with a torpedo, damaging Thor and causing a lot of flooding. She had to be saved by the two armored cruisers Norge and Eidsvoll. Plans were made to convert the Thor into some kind of a monitor, replacing her main battery turret with a single large caliber main gun. However, this proved to be easier said than done. The project was shelved and the ship was scrapped. The next two battleships in service in this time period was the Kronprins and Monarch. However, these were not Norwegian designs at all. They were, respectively, the German Kronprinz and the French Republique class battleships, taken over as war operations. They were given some refits to make them more suitable for Norwegian service, and they did serve on for a number of years before being retired and eventually scrapped. Their finest hour would perhaps be one of the battles of Jutland against Spain. In September of 1896, where they would lead the battle and sink a larger Spanish task force in the North Sea. During this time, a number of French and Austrian-built armored cruisers were also in service. However, none of these have been preserved, and they were all scrapped when they were considered obsolete. Not that many years after being taken into service, but the service they rendered in the time they were in service was incredibly valuable for the young Norwegian Navy, which at the time lacked many of the ships needed to fulfill all the tasks that were required for what was soon to become a small colonial empire, especially with the new islands being taken over in the Caribbean. If there is one bit of legacy that remains from the 4 Austrian-built armored cruisers that were taken over as war operations in the 1890s, it was the use of 10-inch guns. The fact that these could quite easily punch holes through enemy main armor belts and inflict heavy damage before the enemy ships had time to inflict a lot of damage in return was of course quickly realized as being very valuable, and this design was emulated in future heavy cruiser classes, even into the more modern heavy cruiser era, where classes armed with 10-inch guns became the norm. Superseding the Harald Hårfagre class was the Tyr class. More than 18,000 tons, these rivaled early dreadnoughts for size. Originally armed with 2 double 13-inch guns, they had 2/3 the firepower of the first Norwegian dreadnought class, the Fryktløs, but with a heavier secondary battery. In their later years, they were also refit and given 14-inch guns main armament, giving them half the firepower of the second generation Norwegian dreadnought, Tapper. And like the Harald Hårfagre, they were in their last years intended to protect the dreadnoughts from approaching torpedo boats and light cruisers. Both were retired and have been kept as museum ships. If there is one ship class that could be said to define the Norwegian Navy from 1900 and until the Great Norwegian Peace of 1965, it would be the Viking class destroyer. Although they were still classed as destroyers, their use quickly morphed into that of a purebred torpedo boat. What was the original Viking design of 1900 was quite different than what you see here. They originally had a main battery consisting of multiple 4-inch guns, and their main purpose was indeed to be a torpedo boat destroyer and hunt down enemy torpedo boats before they could close in with the battleships. However, they were never really found to be that effective at this job, a curse that would affect many Norwegian destroyer designs in the future. However, they were also originally armed with 3 double 17-inch torpedo tubes for a maximal torpedo volley of 6 torpedoes. And in the Baltic Wars of 1902, they, alongside with the French-built Flamberger-class torpedo boats, put these to great use and sank a number of Russian battleships. This earned them quite a legendary status at the time, as this war was by many not even considered winnable. The Russian Navy was at the time far larger than the Norwegian Navy, and if the war was to be won, it would have to be quickly before the Russian army could mobilize and just march in across Sweden and northern Norway. However, with the Viking and Flamberger-class destroyers and torpedo boats sweeping the oceans clear of Russian capital ships, the rest of the Norwegian Navy was left to conduct naval invasions uninterrupted, and this liberated Finland and the Baltic states in quick succession. Originally built with multiple expansion steam engines, they were designed with the knowledge that work was conducted on a new type of engine, a turbine steam engine, and as such they were built so that the engine could be replaced in the future. And so it was, many times in fact. And the Vikings would go from multiple expansion steam engines to steam turbines to geared steam turbines and finally gas turbines, as you can see here. The Vikings were produced in multiple batches, and the design was continuously refined, and the new batches were produced according to the latest refit of the previous batches. The example you can see here, Viking 14, was launched in 1933, but it was given a refit, in fact multiple refits throughout its service life, and the 1953 refit you can see here does make it identical to the last batch of Vikings launched in the mid-1950s. The number of guns were gradually reduced, and their final configuration only includes one single barrel 3-inch guns, mostly for self-defense purposes and maybe some very optimistic anti-aircraft work. Its main bite is its 3 quintuple 24-inch torpedo tubes, loaded with oxygen-fueled torpedoes. While the tactic most often used by the early configuration Vikings was to single out an enemy ship and launch torpedoes at it, hopefully from multiple directions at once, advances in gunnery made this tactic increasingly dangerous, and with the torpedoes also being continuously updated, with the final oxygen-fueled torpedoes having a range in excess of 20 kilometers. Later configuration Viking tactics mostly consisted of launching massed volleys of torpedoes at long range indiscriminately into enemy formations. While this was also not entirely without risk, it was far safer, and while many Vikings did go down doing this, they undoubtedly also saved lives among the gun line, as the enemy formations would, of course, rather not be hit by 24-inch torpedoes. They had to conduct wild evasive maneuvers, throwing the enemy formations into disarray and disrupting their gunnery, undoubtedly preventing the Norwegian gun line from taking hits in return. Several dozen Vikings were still in active service at the dawn of the Great Norwegian Peace, and they did remain in service into the 1970s. However, at this point, the oldest ships, the oldest hulls, were feeling their age, and the necessary maintenance to just keep them afloat was becoming a bit too taxing. As such, they were gradually retired. Many of the newer hulls were converted into training ships and school ships, even for social programs aimed at delinquent youths. Naturally, their guns and torpedoes were stripped for this purpose. While there was a certain pride associated with being a crew on a Viking torpedo boat, especially in their later years of active service, it was also not a very comfortable service. The greatest strength of the Viking class torpedo boat was its small size, combined with, as of their gas turbine refit, a high speed of 36 knots. This made them very, very uncomfortable in rough seas. Overall, they were cramped, noisy, too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter, and crew members often had to perform extra watches as the ships had no spare crew whatsoever. Nevertheless, they were by far the most successful destroyer design of the Norwegian Navy up until the mid-1960s. The first Norwegian Dreadnought type design has sadly not been preserved. The Fryktløs class was designed with top speed of 21 knots and a main armament of 3 double 13-inch turrets. They were rather small for dreadnoughts, but that was because at the time Norwegian shipyards could not manage ships much bigger than that. At 18,000 tons, they were about the same size as a Tyr-class battleship, but they had much more firepower with 3 main turrets instead of 2, and they were faster and had better fire control. So they were a decent upgrade for pretty much the same size. The next generation of Dreadnought, Torpedo, only one of those were built, but it had a main armament of 4 double 14-inch turrets, putting it on the higher end of early Dreadnought firepower. Tapper, Fryktløs, and Freiri were sadly lost at a battle outside of the Panama Canal in 1947. At that point, they were basically obsolete and should probably have been retired before then. But sadly, they were lost. Some early ships that were not lost and have all been preserved were the Hel-class battlecruisers. While they differ some from what they originally looked like when launched, with new turret housings and a new main tower with better fire control, what you see here is pretty much what they were when launched. Displacing 22,000 tons with a top speed of 25 knots, they were not the most impressive battlecruisers put to sea by any stretch. But with a main armament of 4 double 13-inch guns, they actually outclassed the early Dreadnought battleships in firepower. Armor-wise, they were not bad either. These rendered good service throughout their service life until retired and made into museum ships following the loss of the first generation Dreadnoughts in 1947. It was decided that while these could probably serve on and prove useful for a few more years, losing such famous ships would be a blow to morale. These had a feared reputation among the enemies of the Norwegian Navy, having single-handedly won the war in the Caribbean against the French in the early 1900s, and come in to save the Norwegian Navy from defeat many times after that. It was decided that all 4 battlecruisers were to be preserved as museum ships. While the Hel-class battlecruiser, designed in 1908, was quite impressive for its time, it was soon realized that a battlecruiser could be made quite a bit bigger with greater firepower and a higher top speed. And so in 1913, the battlecruisers Väinämöinen and Ilmarinen, given Finnish names, since this was after the annexation of Finland, were laid down. As you can see it here, this is after its 1920s refit, where the original superstructure was replaced by something much taller, which would prove useful when combined with the later advancements in radar technology. With a top speed of 28 knots and a main armament of 8 14-inch guns, these were on par with a lot of battleships at the time for firepower, but able to outrun the ones they were not on par with. These would serve on well into the 1950s. Their top speed of 28 knots putting them on par with most more modern and faster battleships. The Norwegian Navy decided that in the 1930s that 28 knots would be the top speed of the battle line, and as such, the 28 knot battlecruisers were kept in service, supplementing the more modern, faster battleships. In the 1910s, it also became clear that the cruisers fielded by the Norwegian Navy were also badly outdated. Most of the designs dating from the 1890s or early 1900s, and many of the ships in service were foreign-built ships taken as war operations. And such, the two classes, Norge and Eidsvoll, were laid down. Norge with their 4 double 10-inch guns. Ignore the floating turrets. I guess it must be haunted. And Eidsvoll with 5 triple 8-inch guns. It was intended that the Norge class would target and engage enemy armored cruisers, while Eidsvoll would deal with lighter cruisers and destroyers and torpedo boats. Although you don't always get to choose your opponents, and sometimes these two semi-sibling classes were put up against targets they were not intended to deal with. However, they did render decent service, and many of them have been preserved as museum ships, as you can see here. The two classes were named after original armored cruiser Norge and Eidsvoll, which were sadly lost in the early 1900s in a war against France. At the same time, the Norwegian fleet of light cruisers were also badly outdated. Most of them were also foreign built, like the aforementioned Medusa class, and it was decided to replace them with something more modern. The Brage class was quite revolutionary for its time, with a top speed of 29 knots, which was considered quite fast, and a main armament of 10 7.3-inch guns. These had enough firepower to deal with any enemy light cruiser they were up against, and they were also armed with a couple of torpedoes, 2 triple launchers per side. Secondary armament was rather lackluster, with only a couple of 2-inch guns here and there. Armor was very decent for a light cruiser, 5 inches on the main belt, tapering down to 3 inches on the extended fore and aft belts. While the original Brage that you just saw has been preserved in almost its original configuration, many of these remained in service until the 1950s. The K&M Embla, as you can see here, is one of the more famous cruisers of the class, and rendered very effective service even way after it should have been considered obsolete. Rearmed with more modern 7.5-inch guns, it did lose its 5th turret, but the improved performance of the 7.5-inch gun over the older 7.3 made the loss of 2 gun barrels more than worth it. Powered by more modern gas turbines, their speed had been increased to 30 knots, and maneuverability has been vastly improved over the original configuration. They were also equipped with radar and more modern sonar. A total of 6 of these light cruisers have been preserved as museum ships. The 1920s saw the need for more and larger capital ships. It was decided that the focus should remain on battle cruisers rather than battleships, as the Navy needed ships that could move to hotspots around the globe quicker than the 21-knot battle fleet could manage. The 21-knot Dreadnought battle fleet was kept in service in the home waters, while the battle cruisers were the mobile task force sent to deal with enemies across the globe. Supplementing Ilmarinen and Väinämöinen came Märta and Maud of the Maud class in 1920. These were built to almost the same design, but roughly 50% larger than the Väinämöinen design, and armed with 16-inch guns. These could outgun any enemy battleship afloat at the time, and as battleships in enemy navies grew ever larger, they could, at least for a while, outpace them if they would need to run away. The design you can see here is after their final refits, originally built with a shorter main tower and two funnels. That's how you can recognize the original Märta and Maud. The same is true for Ilmarinen and Väinämöinen. The larger refit main tower, as you can see on this example, allowed for much greater fire control and would prove very effective when combined with advanced radar technology. Another design that entered service in 1920 was the light cruiser Jallarhorn. While this was classed as a light cruiser, in reality it was anything but. With a rather thick main belt, 5 inches around the magazines, tapering down to 4 on the fore and aft belts, and with a main armament of 7.5-inch guns, you could be forgiven for thinking that, isn't this just on par with a Bragi class, just slower? However, with a lot more internal compartmentalization, these were tough ships and could stand up to even heavy cruisers of the time. They were intended as harbor protection ships and could deal with any enemy raiders, aside from capital ships, of course. They were also rather cheap to keep in service, and they remained in service for quite a while, although they did not see much action that was given, as their intended purpose was just harbor defense. They were in service until the 1950s though, and in their final configuration their top speed had been increased to 25 knots, allowing them to keep pace with the modernized Dreadnoughts, which also had a 25-knot top speed. Again, they didn't see much action in their later years or even their early years, but they were considered decent ships for what they were supposed to be. Not content with the 4 modern battlecruisers, Ilmarinen, Väinämöinen, Maud and Märta, it was decided to build another squadron of 4 battlecruisers. These would consist of 2 semi-sibling classes. The first of them, Svea, was armed with 12 14-inch guns mounted in 4 triple turrets. Like the other battlecruisers, they had a top speed of 28 knots. But unlike them, they had a very, very tall main tower, even early on. While this is not exactly its original configuration, it is not that different. Inspired by some Japanese designs, these were very suited for very long range firepower. Armor-wise, they were on par with many battleships of the time, and, like other Norwegian battlecruisers, served on alongside the more modern battleship line. well into the 1950s. The semi-sibling class to Svea were the Stenstude and Kronan, both armed with 8 16-inch guns mounted in 4 double turrets. Otherwise, they were virtually identical, with the 16-inch armed battlecruisers more intended to fight enemy capital ships at long range, while the 14-inch guns would keep enemy cruisers at bay, and enemy light cruisers, light battlecruisers. The 14-inch guns were also effective against capital ships, at least to begin with, but both the 14s and later the 16s were eventually considered inadequate to deal with the ever-growing size of enemy capital ships. That is not to say the Norwegian Navy was not part of that arms race itself, and the battleship Dannebrog was designed in 1924, armed with 12 17.5-inch guns and displacing 56,000 tons. Originally, it had a top speed of 21 knots, as that was the top speed of the Dreadnought battle line at the time. However, it was later refit with more modern engines, and the speed was increased to 25 knots, which became the standard speed for the what was called the slow battleship line, which consisted of modernized dreadnoughts and captured ships, mostly. Dannebrog would remain in service until the 1960s, where she was eventually retired and turned into a museum ship. Her early service was not that stellar. It took a while to work out the kinks with the massive 17-inch guns and make them as accurate and as deadly as they were supposed to be. And by the time they were, 17.5-inch guns were not really considered as insanely huge as they were at the time of her launch. So she didn't really enjoy her fame as the most powerful battleship afloat until that was no longer the case for her. One of the ships that would serve alongside Dannebrog was the Greek-built Aegon, launched 2 years prior and designed in 1922. She was 16,000 tons lighter than Dannebrog, but had a comparable main armament of 8 17.2-inch guns mounted in 4 double turrets, and a similar top speed. Both would serve in the same slow battleship squadron until the 1960s. Aegon was received by the Norwegian Navy as war operations after one of the many wars against the Byzantine Empire, later Greece. Speaking of captured ships, the 2 heavy cruisers, Sørreisa and Arneberg, were received as war operations from the Dutch in the 1920s. Designed in the early 1920s, these were quite a shock to the Norwegian Navy. These were heavy cruisers with the speed of light cruisers, and yet they had the armor and the firepower of a true heavy cruiser, armed with 8 10.5-inch guns in 4 double turrets, and a very good main belt armor of 8 inches, tapering down to 3 on the fore and aft belts. These could manage 30 knots, which was at the time even in excess of the new Brage class light cruiser. This initiated the Norwegian cruiser program of the 1920s. Realizing that Norge and Eidsvoll class heavy cruisers, designed only 8 years prior, were already becoming obsolete, the Norwegian Navy decided to launch a construction program of more modern heavy cruisers. However, limitations to budget and construction capacity meant that only 2 could be constructed. This would be Hugin and Munin of the Hugin class. With a top speed of 32 knots, barely exceeding the 2 captured Dutchmen, and a main armament of 12 10.2-inch guns, they somehow displaced 3,000 tons less than the two captured Dutch cruisers, while at least on paper exceeding them in speed and firepower. However, the triple turrets were proven not to be quite as accurate as the double barrel turrets on the two Dutchmen. While only two were constructed, the Norwegian shipbuilders did learn some lessons from the program, and these would be taken into account in future cruiser programs. Both Hugin and Munin survive and are in service even by the 1970s. Supplementing Hugin and Munin would be the four Heimdall class heavy cruisers, with very similar specifications: 12 10-inch guns and a top speed of 32 knots. The two classes were very similar, although technically they are not sister ships. Like Hugin and Munin, the four Heimdall class cruisers would see service into the 1970s before being retired. The late 1920s also saw some experimentation when it came to light cruiser design. The Ran class, of which only one survived, had a top speed of 30 knots and was armed with 12 6.9-inch guns. These would not see that much action, and only a couple were built, and only one survived, currently as a museum ship in Tromsø. They were retired by the 1960s. The Torstein class was a far more impressive design, but it was decided at the time that it was too expensive and not many of them were built. However, it would serve as the basis for some future light cruiser designs that would serve on well into the 1970s and prove very effective. The third of the so-called experimental light cruiser classes of the late 1920s was the Ragnar class, displacing only 5,500 tons and armed with 8 7.5-inch guns. They had a modest top speed of 27 knots. The main goal of this design was to create a light cruiser that was cheap, yet had enough firepower to deal with enemy light cruisers. This was somewhat effective. However, many of these were lost fighting the Germans in the Mediterranean not that long after they were constructed. Only one now survive as a museum ship. It was retired by the 1950s. The early 1930s saw rapid technological developments, and one of the most successful designs was the Harald Hårfagre, named after the original Pre-dreadnought battleship that had been lost not that much earlier, after it was probably obsolete. This new battleship had a top speed of 28 knots, the same as the battlecruisers in service at the time. However, the firepower consisted of 12 17.5-inch guns, same as the battleship Dannebrog, which was at the time still considered quite modern and powerful. This new ship displaced a whopping 70,000 tons and was powered by turbo-electric engines, effortlessly propelling it up to 28 knots and with a very decent operational range of 26,000 kilometers. The armor belt was 16 inches thick at the main belt, tapering to 5 at the fore and aft belts. It had a layered citadel which was never breached. Not even its sister ship, Olav Haraldsson, had its citadel breached. It was, however, sunk in a battle with the American Navy in the 1950s. Harald Hårfagre remains as a museum ship and remained in service until the 1980s. Another fairly effective early 1930s design was the Jager 33 or J-33 class destroyer. These were, at the time they were launched, faster than the Vikings, and with subsequent upgrades, they remained faster than the Vikings, with their top speed reaching 38 knots. Only one other Norwegian destroyer class has ever reached this top speed, and that was the J-43 10 years later. While they were impressive ships and had a main armament consisting of 9 5-inch guns, unlike the Vikings, these could actually punch back if it came to a gunfight with enemy destroyers. Their torpedo armament consisted of 9 24-inch torpedo tubes in 3 quintuple launchers. This was, however, the same as the Viking class, despite this ship displacing significantly more than the 700-ton Vikings. 3,500 tons for the J-33. This made them easier to hit by enemy gunfire, despite them being faster. So their survivability was not quite on par with the Vikings when it came to launching massive torpedo waves against enemy formations. New heavy cruisers were also ordered at this time, and the 1934 designed V class heavy cruiser, of which 4 were built, was armed with 8 11-inch guns mounted in 4 double turrets. With a top speed of 32 knots, they had similar armor thickness to other Norwegian heavy cruisers at the time, although they were considerably larger at 17,500 tons. One of these 4 were lost, the other 3 survived and remained in service until the 1980s. Other nations were also perfectly capable of crafting ships that could remain in service for many decades after launch. For example, the British Agincourt class battlecruiser. One of these remained still and was taken as war operations by the Norwegian Navy in the 1930s, at which time it was still a pretty new ship. This remained in service with the Norwegian Navy until the 1980s. With a top speed of 32 knots, this was a very fast battlecruiser for the time, and could even keep up with later Norwegian battlecruisers, like the Fridtjof Nansen class. Its main armament consisted of 8 18.5-inch guns mounted in 4 double turrets. These guns were larger than even those mounted on the Harald Hårfagre class battleships, and this prompted the Norwegian Navy to look for something to mount even bigger guns on. It was clear that 17.5-inch guns were no longer the biggest sticks around. This point was hammered home when the Norwegian Navy encountered the French Requiem class battleship. These were designed all the way back in 1927, just a couple years after the Dannebrog class battleship that the Norwegian Navy designed. These were armed with 18.5-inch guns, like that British battlecruiser, and displaced only 51,000 tons. Lighter than the Dannebrog despite having larger main caliber guns, and it was faster at 28 knots. One of these was taken as war operations by the Norwegian Navy in the 1930s, and would serve alongside the Harald Hårfagre class for a few decades until it was considered obsolete and retired. It's interesting that when it was taken over as war operations, this prompted the Norwegian Navy to consider the Harald Hårfagre no longer adequate for being the biggest battleship in the Navy, and prompted new designs. Yet the Harald Hårfagre outlived the Requiem class in Norwegian service by many decades. The one taken as war operations, Kurland, was retired in the early 1960s and turned into a museum ship stationed in occupied France, its country of origin. But while design work continued on what would eventually be the new largest battleship in Norwegian service, work did not stop on constructing new cruisers. The Frigg class was armed with 16 9.5-inch guns and had a top speed of 32 knots. It had an impressive secondary battery of many 5.9-inch guns, 4 double turrets per side with one mounted on the center line. Unlike other heavy cruisers in the Norwegian Navy, the Frigg class was also equipped with torpedoes, 4 quintuple 24-inch torpedo launchers, 2 per side. This was, however, also an Achilles heel, because these launchers were unprotected and the torpedoes were quite explosive. Nevertheless, the ships of this class would continue serving into the 1970s before being retired. Another effective 1934 design was the light cruiser Hati. These would be constructed in many batches throughout the 1930s and would serve on well into the 1970s. Based on the 1927 Dreadnought design, these were not quite as impressive as the Dreadnought in terms of firepower, with fewer main gun turrets. However, and also they were also lacking in torpedoes. However, they were more balanced and were considered quite excellent ships, providing good service throughout their entire service life. With a top speed of 35 knots, these were at the time the fastest Norwegian light cruisers, and 35 knots would be the new standard for Norwegian light cruiser design. The 12 auto-loading 7.5-inch guns were mounted in 4 triple turrets, and the secondary battery consisted of multiple 3-inch guns. The main armor, like many other light cruisers, consisted of a 5-inch main belt tapering down to 3 inches on the fore and aft belts, and a layered citadel with 3 layers of armor, which would, in theory, protect it even from the guns of enemy heavy cruisers. However, it was found in practice that they would not really stand up to heavy cruiser fire, and it was eventually decided that light cruisers should not go up against heavy cruisers and should rather try to run away, even if on paper it seemed like they would have a chance. Kanari of the Greek-built Kanaris class was another 32-knot capable battlecruiser pressed into Norwegian service after being taken as a war prize from what was then called the Byzantine Empire. Displacing more than 42,000 tons, she was a very large battlecruiser for the time, but her main armament of 10-13 inches was, even back then, considered a little bit inadequate. Nevertheless, at the time, Norway had no home-built 32-knot capable battlecruisers, and she would serve on alongside the British-built 32-knot capable battlecruisers for quite some time. Alongside the British battlecruisers, Kanari did synergize quite well. While the larger British 18-inch guns could deal with heavier capital ships and heavy cruisers, the lighter 13-inch guns were more suitable for dealing with light cruisers and even destroyers. However, she was also found to be quite fragile. Despite the armor not really being that bad, it was just not a very strongly built ship, and internal damage would quickly spread. as the bulkheads were not really strong enough to contain explosions from penetrating enemy shells. In the same way that some Norwegian built 28-knot battlecruisers from even decades prior had really no problem with. As Norway gradually built more 32-knot battlecruisers of her own, the fate of Kanadi was pretty much sealed as an active duty combat ship, and she was retired in the early 1960s and put into reserve. While refits and conversions were considered, it was ultimately decided to just sell her off to the new Greek island city-state of Crete. Returned to her original owners in the late 1960s, she was put back into frontline service as the Greek Navy flagship in the early 1970s. However, the tiny Greek island city-state really did not have the budget to keep a capital ship in service, and she was retired again in the mid-1970s and eventually scrapped. The ship's bell, part of her main tower, and one of the 13-inch turrets have been preserved at the Greek Naval Museum at Heraklion. In 1936, it was decided to lay down a new class of battlecruisers. As battleships were now going at 28 knots, it was decided that this new class would have a higher top speed of 32 compared to the 28 knots that had previously been the standard for the battlecruiser line. This became the Fridtjof Nansen class battlecruiser, comparatively light when compared to some battlecruisers built by other nations like the British Agincourt, armed with 15-inch guns, 12 of them in 4 triple turrets, and displacing 35,000 tons. They did pack a lot of punch for a rather small package. They were also decently armored, and with radar fire control and auto-loading guns, they could put a lot of shells on target in not too long time. Fairly advanced with the turbo-electric drive that had become the standard for the Norwegian Navy at the time, and with a good operational range of 25,000 kilometers. These saw a lot of service both as a combined task force with all 4 of them, or split up doing convoy protection and convoy raiding in the many wars in which they saw service. In the 1960s, they would be refit, having their 12 15-inch guns replaced by 8 16-inch guns in 4 double turrets, and the 5-inch secondary battery replaced by 5.9-inch secondary guns, which had become the standard on many classes at the time. Speed remained the same, although the range was reduced down to 20,000 kilometers, which was still considered more than adequate. Armor was also slightly improved, and a more advanced radar was installed. This refit was conducted in the mid-1960s. They would continue on serving throughout the 1970s, being put into reserve in the 1980s before finally being retired and made into museum ships. Alongside the single Agincourt class British-built battlecruiser, another British-built battlecruiser was put into Norwegian service. The K&M Iherdig of the British Indomitable class was taken over as war operations in the 1940s. This was laid down in 1939, just a couple years after the Fridtjof Nansen class, and on paper would outclass them in almost every single way. It had the same 32-knot top speed, but it was armed with 8 18.1-inch guns. This could potentially have gone much faster than 32 knots, but it was decided not to push it further. It was considered pointless to have a single battlecruiser being a lot faster than anything else it could potentially operate alongside. It would be considered wasteful, and the displacement that could have been taken up by a more powerful engine was instead used for semi-auto reloading systems for the main guns and a more potent radar set. Other modifications were also made to the British-built ship, and it served on until the 1970s, when it was retired. Another British war prize of the same era was the Canopus-class battleship Dominant. This prompted the Norwegian Navy to increase the speed of its existing super dreadnoughts to 25 knots, and 25 knots became the new speed for the slow dreadnought line. Some of these super dreadnoughts were kept in service until the 1960s, although they mostly conducted shore bombardment. Canopus, the Canopus class battleship Dominant, remained in service until the 1960s, alongside other captured ships like the Greek-built Aegon. Laid down in 1952, one could be forgiven for thinking that the Gustav Vasa class battleship, Gustav Vasa, Frejdig, and Tapper, were a lot older, because by appearance they look more like they were made in maybe the 1920s or 30s. These were built to replace the recently lost Fryktløs, Frejdig, and Tapper that were lost in battle in 1947. They were given the same 25 knot top speed as the now refit Dannebrog and the captured Dominant that we just saw. This was intended to make up a low cost, low displacement battleship squadron that could operate from ports that could maybe not fit the largest super battleships of the 1950s. Alongside Dominant and Dannebrog, these three mostly conducted shore bombardments until being retired in the 1960s. Another of these late super dreadnoughts was the massive Magnus Lagabøte, weighing in at 87,000 tons and armed with 8 18.5-inch guns. Again, this had a top speed of 25 knots, relegating it to the slow battleship line. Although it was the largest and most powerful of the slow super dreadnoughts, it was, like the others, in many ways obsolete when it was launched. It mostly conducted shore bombardments with the other modern super dreadnoughts. It was armored along the all or nothing type armor scheme that was popular at the time, although weaknesses to that type of armor scheme was later discovered, as the fore and aft belts, being only 1.5 inches thick, could easily be penetrated by high caliber, high explosive shells or by cruiser caliber guns. Stepping back again to the 1930s, the French-built Béarn-class battleships were massive super battleships displacing more than 96,000 tons, and with a top speed of 28 knots, they could keep up with fast battleships and battlecruisers. The most impressive thing about them was their main armament, consisting of 20-inch guns. Originally, as built in France, they had 4 triple turrets for a total of 12 20-inch guns. However, after 4 of these were taken as war operations, the French-made 20-inch guns were found inadequate. the range and accuracy was not on par with even the Norwegian 16-inch guns at the time. So the armories at Kongsberg set to work at upgrading the 20-inch guns, and enough displacement was found that the A and Y turrets could be replaced by quadruple turrets, upping the number of guns to 14. These new 20-inch guns had vastly superior range and accuracy to the original French guns, and these 4 battleships, renamed after the 4 great authors Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, Alexander Kielland, Jonas Lie and Henrik Ibsen, these would serve on well into the 1970s and placed into reserve throughout the 80s and even 90s before finally being replaced by the new missile battleships of the 1990s. While they never performed well in the hands of their original French creators, in Norwegian service these would have a very illustrious battle record and be at the forefront of many large naval invasions, as well as full-on naval battles. They were also considered some of the most attractive looking ships in service, even well into the 1970s. In 1941, the existence of these French battleships was already known, as well as the existence of other large super battleships in the German, British and American navies. And so it was decided that the Norwegian Navy needed super battleships of their own, and the Dovre class was laid down. Displacing 96,000 tons and with a top speed of 28 knots, these would for a while be the largest battleships in Norwegian service. They were armed with 12 18.5-inch guns in 3 quadruple turrets. This was a departure from the previous standard of having 4 main turrets in an ABXY layout, although that standard would later return. There were rather long ships, and like many other super battleships, were quite cumbersome and hard to maneuver. And avoiding enemy torpedoes proved to be quite a challenge, even in those cases where the torpedoes were detected early. Simply moving the battleship out of the way of the torpedo was easier said than done. Another British battlecruiser that entered Norwegian service at the same time as the Indomitable class Iherdi was the defense class KNM Sonja. Curiously, this battlecruiser had a main armament layout of double and triple barrel turrets, and it was perhaps this that prompted the Norwegian Navy to refit the French Béarn class battleship with a mix of triple and quadruple turrets. With a top speed of 32 knots, the defense class battlecruiser Sonja could keep up with the other British battlecruisers in service and formed a squadron alongside them. These battlecruisers together had some success against their former masters, but were mostly relegated to far-off patrol duty. It is interesting to note that the Norwegian Navy would never launch any battlecruisers of their own with guns larger than 16 inches, although they would certainly appreciate the firepower of the British-built battlecruisers that were all armed with 18s. In 1938, while the Viking class torpedo boat destroyers, and that is torpedo boat destroyer not as in a ship that is intended to destroy torpedo boats, which was the original purpose of a torpedo boat destroyer, but rather a destroyer that is more focused towards its role of being a torpedo boat. While the Vikings were still in production and a new batch had just been ordered, it was decided that something larger was needed, something with a lot more firepower that could actually go up against enemy destroyers and torpedo boats in a gunfight, which the Vikings were just incapable of. The J-33 had been considered quite effective, and the J-38 was built alongside the same lines, displacing 3,700 tons and armed with 9 5.9-inch guns. These were quite big, almost at the same size of a light cruiser. They had an impressive torpedo armament of 4 quintuple launchers, giving it a volley of 20 24-inch oxygen-fueled torpedoes. Their downside, however, was their size, and they proved just much easier to hit for enemy guns than the smaller Vikings. This meant that the recently ordered new batch of Viking class destroyers were not cancelled, and they were put into production and remained in service even after the J-38s were retired in the late 1970s. Håkon Adalsteinfosteret was a battleship constructed in the late 1930s, early 1940s, with some construction delays. Only one was produced to its design. It had a main armament of 8 18-inch guns in 4 double turrets, reverting back to the traditional ABXY turret layout that was common before the Dovre class. They were smaller than the Dovre class super battleships, displacing 73,000 tons, and it would serve alongside the modern Harald Hårfagre class battleships. And while it was intended to be the blueprint for new battleships of the same type, only one was constructed, but lessons learned were put into use in future battleships. But not after some more experimentation, such as the Torfinn Karlsevne class battleships. 2 of them were constructed in the early 1940s, Torfinn Karlsevne and Leif Eriksson. These were armed with 20-inch guns, as it was known that other nations like France, Germany and Britain were arming battleships with guns of that caliber at the time. The turret layout was unconventional, with an ABCX turret layout. The C turret could not quite superfire over the B turret unless it was elevated first, so that reduced its usable arc of fire until the target was at more than 10,000 kilometers, which was easily inside the range of these massive guns. Their baptism of fire, suitably enough, came against German super battleships also armed with 20-inch guns, and they performed decently well, although the massive German super battleships outweighed them by a lot and had vastly superior armor. The guns were gradually improved, improving their penetration, accuracy and range. But as the German super battleships gradually went extinct, they never had a chance to see how superior the new guns were up against enemy super battleships again. They were decently effective at dealing with cruisers and more mundane sized battleships though. These 2 battleships remained in service until the 1970s. Built to similar lines, but with vastly different main armaments, Surtoll and Gugnir were armed with 15 16-inch guns in 5 triple turrets in an ABCDX layout. The A, B, C, and D turrets could all superfire, giving the ships an impressive forward volley of 12 barrels, not including the 8-inch secondary guns. These two ships would see a lot of service in the American wars of the 1940s, operating alongside the American East Coast and in the Caribbean. They would serve throughout the 1970s before being put into reserve in the 1980s and finally made into museum ships in the 1990s. While battleships would gradually revert back to the tried and tested ABXY turret layout, these multiple superfiring turrets would live on in Norwegian battlecruisers later. As the 1940s rolled on, it was again clear that the Navy needed more cruisers to escort all of these new battleships, and the Freya class was laid down in 1944, armed with 12 10-inch guns and a top speed of 32 knots. They were quite typical for Norwegian heavy cruisers at the time. Perhaps their most standout feature was their new gas turbine engines and the extensive torpedo protection scheme that they had. The Freya class heavy cruisers would be produced in large numbers, and 16 of them remained in service until the 1970s. The Tonnignjostedt class light cruiser was also produced in large numbers and remained in service until the 1980s. They were somewhat reminiscent of the earlier Hati class light cruisers, but instead of 4 triple turrets with a total of 12 guns, they had a total of 12 guns in 3 quadruple turrets. They were, however, also armed with torpedoes, and the secondary battery consisted of multiple quadruple 3.5-inch guns. While initially criticized for being too fragile for a cruiser at its admittedly rather high cost, they did prove very effective and served on well into the 1980s. Some of them were even converted to missile cruisers and would remain in service even into the 2000s. One of the wilder designs to come out of the 1940s was the Jaeger 43 or Ormenlange class destroyers, weighing in at more than 5,000 tons and armed with a wild torpedo armament of 16 torpedo, displacing more than 5,500 tons and armed with an impressive torpedo armament consisting of 8 quadruple launchers and a single quintuple launcher. The idea was that these would launch their torpedoes first from one side, then turn about and launch from the other side. However, in practice this proved very difficult, and the large J-43 class destroyers proved as easy to hit as any other ship of its size, which was quite a bit easier to hit than a much smaller Viking. Most of these would be sunk with only one remaining, and it would be phased out of service in the 1960s and made into a museum ship. Another ship, of which only one remains, is the battlecruiser Tordenskjold. Its sister ship Bustenskjold would be lost in battle against American battleships in the 1960s. These were at the time, the fastest Norwegian battlecruisers, with a top speed of 36 knots They were somewhat experimental, with a very long, narrow hull, and with 6 triple turrets in an ABC XYZ layout, all triple super firing. Some of this was inspiration taken from the battleship classes Torfinnkarlsevne and Sur-12, with the multiple super firing turrets. While they proved to be very effective at dealing with enemy cruisers, they could not really go up against enemy capital ships, as Bustenschol sadly found out. That is not to say that certain design aspects did not survive and made it into future designs, though. By 1948, it was clear that the J-38, 33 and 43 class destroyers were not quite as capable of gunning down enemy destroyers as had been hoped, and a new class was laid down, the J-48. These destroyers had a lighter torpedo armament than many other Norwegian destroyers at the time, but had more main gun firepower. Originally armed with a mixture of single and triple barrel turrets, with 1 single barrel 5-inch turret amidships, and 3 triple turrets in an ABX layout. These never really lived up to their intended purpose, and many of them were lost even in what was supposedly fair 1 versus 1 duels with enemy destroyers. They were eventually refit, and the mixed triple and single turret layout of 5-inch guns was replaced by 4 single 5.9-inch guns, and in this configuration they did see some success in the mid-1960s. After the J-48s were found inadequate, the J-54 class was laid down, also armed with triple 5-inch guns. These were also found to not be quite as capable at dealing with enemy destroyers in a fair gunfight. And, like the J-48s, in the 1960s they were refit and had their triple 5-inch turrets removed and replaced with single 5.9-inch guns, as had been found very effective with the British Liberty class, which was also armed with single 5.8-inch guns. Many of these would sadly be lost before that refit could take place, though. But once refit with the single 5.9-inch guns, they did prove effective in the mid-1960s, and would serve on throughout the 1970s and being put into reserve in the 1980s. Some of these have been preserved as museum ships, but many of them were also scrapped. While the German-built Schleswig-Holstein class battleships were not the largest German-built battleships of the 1940s, 1930s era, it was the largest that made it into Norwegian service. Sadly, only one remained to be taken as a war prize after the war, and it was given some semi-extensive refits, also to repair damage taken in battle. Originally armed with 12 20-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, the B and X turrets were replaced with dual barrel guns instead, reducing the number of guns down to 10. With a displacement of 131,000 tons, it was easily the largest ship in Norwegian service, and remains the largest ever to have been put in Norwegian service. It did serve on throughout the 1970s and 80s, and plans were made to convert it into a missile battery battleship. However, at that time, it was a very worn down ship that needed extensive maintenance to remain afloat, and it was instead demilitarized and turned into, you guessed it, a museum ship. While Edvard Grieg, the single Schleswig-Holstein class battleship, was the only battleship taken over as a war prize from the Germans, the German shipbuilders did provide the Norwegian Navy with a few other hulls, such as the battlecruiser Prinz Eitel Friedrich, renamed Kronprinz Fredrik. Displacing 47,000 tons, its main armament of 13.3-inch guns, 8 of them in 4 twin turrets, was considered light for a ship of its size. However, it did have an impressive top speed of 35 knots and a rather fuel-efficient diesel engine. Compared to many other Norwegian battlecruisers, its service life was not the most interesting, but it did have some successful patrols in the Pacific. With a top speed of only 28 knots, the German-built Lützow-class heavy cruisers were initially considered too slow to enter Norwegian service, as the standard speed for a heavy cruiser was at the time 32 knots. However, it was found that these would be ideal escort ships for the new super battleship Edvard Grieg, as they had the same speed. They were also rather large, and with a silhouette reminiscent of a battleship, it would appear as if the single super battleship with an escort of 3 heavy cruisers could in fact be a battleship squadron of 4 battleships. They were also fairly tough for cruisers and could remain in the line of battle alongside the battleship without too much fear of being deleted by enemy battleship caliber guns. Armed with a heavy main armament of 10 11-inch guns, their main job was to keep enemy cruisers and destroyers away from the massive super battleship Edvard Grieg, a task which they performed well enough. 3 were taken over as war operations, and they remained in service until the 1980s. In the early 1950s, following the loss of the original earliest Norwegian dreadnoughts in a battle off the Panama Canal in 1947, it was decided that the same fate should never happen to the famous battlecruisers of the Hale class. So they were retired and all converted into museum ships in the early 1950s. To replace them, the new Fenris class was laid down. 4 of them, all bearing the names of the original Hale class battlecruisers. These had a top speed of 32 knots, which at the time was the standard for a Norwegian battlecruisers, and a main armament of 10 14.5-inch guns in 5 twin turrets in an ABCXY layout. Here, the C turret could not quite superfire over the B turret, except at very long ranges with the guns elevated. Many design aspects of these battlecruisers were also carried over from the Surtoll and Torfinn Karlsevne class battleships, and the hulls do look very similar. They are, however, quite a bit smaller at only 45,000 tons. But as far as battlecruisers go, they were quite tough ships. They did remain in service until the 1980s, at which time they were getting worn out. Following the loss of the battleship Olav Haraldsson of the Harald Hårfagre class, it was decided that the next class of modern fast battleships should bear that name. A dozen of these were constructed from the mid-1950s and until the late 1960s, and they gradually replaced older battleships in service. Built along the lines of Harald Hårfagre, they were, however, 10,000 tons heavier and armed with a heavier main battery of 18.5-inch guns. 10 guns in 2 triple and 2 twin turrets in a very traditional AB-XY layout. Secondary guns consisted of 7.5-inch guns and 4.9-inch guns. They were powered by the same turboelectric drive engines that had been the standard for many decades already, and there was nothing really experimental or innovative to the design. It was just a very refined version of designs already in service. Armor was exceedingly heavy, and the 18-inch main belt even covered the entire aft section where the original Olav Haraldsson had been hit and sunk. While one squadron of 4 of these had barely entered service and would see action against the Germans in the 1964 war with Germany, most of these would never see ship-to-ship combat and would be relegated to policing actions after the Great Norwegian Peace of 1965. Following the war with the United States in the late 1950s, many of the American Macon-class heavy cruisers were taken over as war operations and given extensive refits to make them more suitable for Norwegian service. Among the modifications was a replacement of the single battery, which consisted of a paltry 4 10-inch guns in 4 single turrets. These were replaced by 8 10.3-inch guns in 4 twin turrets in the traditional AB-XY layout. What made these cruisers stand out from the home-built Norwegian cruisers, which often had a heavier main armament despite displacing less than the 18,500 ton Macons. What made the Macon stand out was their very high top speed of almost 37 knots, making them faster than even the fastest Norwegian light cruisers. Indeed, only the J-33 and 43 class destroyers would be able to outpace them, and only just barely, and only in calm seas. Owing to their uniquely high speed, these cruisers would remain in Norwegian service well into the 1980s. Norwegian heavy cruiser designs of the 1950s were quite experimental. The Mime and Mimir classes were built along very similar hull lines, but differed greatly in main armament. Mime was armed with 5 11.9-inch guns in 5 single turrets, and a secondary battery of 16 5.9-inch guns in 8 dual turrets, 4 per side. Their half-sisters, the Mimir class, had a main armament consisting of 24 8.5-inch guns in 6 quadruple turrets. Unlike Mime, the Mimir class had no secondary battery to speak of, but instead had 8 quintuple 24-inch torpedo launchers, 4 per side, in the exact same spots where Mime had their 5.9-inch guns. These would see some action against the Germans in the 1964 war, with varying degrees of success. They would be phased out in the 1970s and replaced with more traditional cruiser designs. While many Norwegian ships of the era were very experimental, that could not be said of the K-55 class corvettes. Displacing 17,000 tons, 1.7 thousand tons, and armed with 12 4.2-inch guns, they were quite mundane, but they did render effective service in wars against both Germans and British fleets in the early 1960s. They were, however, considered a bit obsolete already by the 1970s and were phased out of service. Some lived on as minesweepers or training ships, and a few of them were converted to museum ships. But no 1950s design could be considered more experimental and more unorthodox than the Petterdass class fast battlecruiser. With a top speed of 36 knots and built along similar lines to the Tordenskjold class, what set these apart were their main armament, consisting of 7 single 16-inch guns mounted in single turrets in an A, B, C, D, E, X, Y layout. The A, B, C, D, E turrets could all superfire and could all be brought to bear dead ahead, even at close range. Critics did claim that only 7 guns would be insufficient, as Norwegian battlecruisers would have been armed with 8 16-inch guns even back in the 1910s. However, with a barrel length of 60 calibers, these were longer ranged and more accurate than 16-inch guns of the past. That said, these ships were rather fragile compared to many other battlecruisers of the Norwegian Navy, and their armor was closer to that of a heavy cruiser rather than most Norwegian battlecruisers, which typically had a main belt of 14 inches. They also lacked a proper secondary battery with just one triple 7.5-inch turret and a couple of 4.9-inch turrets, aside from some 2-inch anti-aircraft guns, of course. 2 of these would be built, Petterdass and the sister ship Odin. Odin would just barely squeeze in a little bit of action in the war against Germany of 1964, where she engaged a German light cruiser. While the battle was victorious and Odin took no damage in return, that was about what you should expect from a battlecruiser going up against a light cruiser. They would serve on into the early 1970s before being put in reserve. In the late 70s and early 1980s, projects were undertaken to convert these to missile battery battlecruisers, and the gun turrets were removed and the barbettes converted into vertical tube missile launchers. As missile-armed battlecruisers, they would serve on into the early 1990s, but they were never really considered good ships, and were notoriously unstable owing to their long, slender hulls and that massively tall pagoda tower. Plans were drawn up to replace the tower with something more modern and also redo the entire missile armament. However, these were shelved and the ships were scrapped in the early 2000s. Nevertheless, they remain some of the most unique looking ships ever put to service in the Norwegian Navy, and the only ships ever to be built with an ABCDE-XY turret layout, with the 5 ABCDE turrets all superfiring to the front ships. In 1958, following the war with Britain, 2 of the British Liberty-class destroyers were taken over as war operations. While these were never actually put into Norwegian service, they were studied and their main armament, consisting of single 5.8-inch guns, had been proven very effective in combat against Norwegian destroyers in the previous war. As such, it was copied over for the refits of the J-48 and J-54 class destroyers. The two Liberty class British built destroyers were later sunk as target ships. And that brings us to the final Norwegian ship design before the Great Norwegian Peace of 1965. The Theodor Larsen class super battleships of 1963 looked a lot like many other Norwegian battleships. 12 main guns in 4 triple turrets in a traditional ABXY layout. These, however, displaced a total of 110,000 tons, only 20,000 tons smaller than the massive Edvard Grieg, the German-built Schleswig-Holstein class battleship. They had a top speed of 28 knots, like so many other battleships. At the time where these were laid down, it was already very clear that Norwegian dominance of the seas was unchallenged. As such, these were not so much intended as battleships to combat enemy battleships, but more a show of force, and as flagships. The main battery 20-inch guns were also configured more for shore bombardment than for actual ship-to-ship combat, although they did see battle against the Germans in 1964 and proved to be very effective even at that. A total of 8 of these would be built, and they would serve alongside the 16 Olav Haraldsson class battleships throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. 6 of them would, in the mid-1980s, be converted to semi-missile battery battleships, with the X and Y turrets taken out and replaced by vertical launch missile tubes. The A and B turrets were retained, and these would serve on in that configuration throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, where they were placed in reserve. The 2 ships that were not converted were, of course, turned into museum ships. So that has been the brief history of some of the most important ships that brought us the peace and prosperity that we enjoy today. I hope you enjoyed that. Goodbye, and take care.